Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Saina. I lead Sankalp Forum globally across India, Africa, and some of the newer markets that we will be entering into. This is our inaugural Sankalp Dialogues, and I'm excited to be here and bring you this entire series of sessions that we are holding from the month of May onwards. Really, all of these sessions have been curated because we listened hard to a lot of the conversations that happened in the room at our Africa Summit earlier this year. And we felt that there was a need for a continuity in dialogue, right? Beyond the convening, to bring some of the stakeholders that were in those rooms with a wider audience across Africa and India and different parts of the frontier markets and the global south to discuss some of these issues so that we can bring together a solution architecture or work towards bringing together a solution architecture. So, with the inaugural dialogue on this topic of the $1 to $5 million missing gap, we all know that this problem exists. So, this webinar or this dialogue is not so much to peel the onion over and over again and try and understand why that problem exists, but we'll try to take the conversation in the direction of, therefore, what can the solution architectures look like? And to have this discussion, we've brought together a stakeholder group that actually covers funders, investors, capital allocators in India and Africa. Any of these dialogues without the voice of founders, enterprise owners, SME owners, the guys who actually require the capital and build with that capital to bring about, to build transformative businesses would be amiss. And therefore, we have two founders with us as well, each of whom to share their perspectives on what it has taken for them to bridge some of this gap and have their own thoughts and views on what some of this capital architecture should look like. We, of course, as a group, alongside the panelists, we've discussed some of the questions that we want to go through, some of the topics that we will touch upon. But I'd really like this session to be a dialogue amongst all of us. So I'll request you all to please use either the chat window or the Q&A window to keep keying in your questions, and I'll try to incorporate them into the conversation that we are having today. If time allows, I'd love for you all to also, if it's possible, for you all to unmute or come on camera and post your questions. From all the folks that registered, what we roughly saw, there was a good mix of both founders, capital allocators, as well as practitioners, which tells me that there is a lot of curiosity and possibly views on what we should be doing in this space. I hope for a good degree of engagement. And on that note, I think what I'll do is I'll start with our panelists. I'd like to maybe go around the table, come to each of you with a specific question. And while you'll answer that question, it would also be good for you all to give a little bit of a flavor of the kind of fund or business that you all manage so that we get a context setting of who you are and why you do what you do. So let me start with you, Rema. You, of course, are the co-founder and managing partner of Ankur Capital, one of India's funds that actually focuses on science, climate, deep tech investing, one of the first of its kind in the country. You manage close to $200 odd million now across your different vehicles, and you all deploy equity, right? Tell us a little bit more about the fund, of course, but also to your mind on this question of this missing fundability gap in that 1 to 5 million. Where do you place the largest problem statement with? Is it with enterprises who are not ready to absorb that capital? Is it with investors? Or is it just that as a community, we haven't thought of capital structures that are suitable for enterprises well enough? So over to you, Rema. Rema, I think you must unmute.
Sorry.
That's
Thank
okay.
you. Thanks, Saina, for having me here. And pleasure being here.
And thanks for the introduction. Yes, we are in early stage investment. Our philosophy comes from the fact that if you would need to create a structural change, if you need to create a much larger impact, then you would have to invest into science and technology. That disruption happens only through innovation. That's the core philosophy with which we invest in. And we invest in pre-Series A. So typically we invest in that 1 to 2 million range in the first round and follow it on with further capital, going up to 5 to 8 million. Our core philosophy comes from the fact we invest into IP, and these IP are not just regional IP. It's not an India-only IP, but we invest into IP that's looking at global IP. The reason being that even with all the macro geopolitical issues, there is still a porousness with which technologies travel across the globe. And hence, it becomes important that you are the best. You cannot be the second best. You cannot be and also ran. And hence, you have to look at IP. So for us, the key thing is the fact that we look for IP that is global IP coming out of India because we are an India-based fund. So a large part of the team or the company is incorporated in India. So that's the core of what we do. So the question on the gap, there's obviously multiple reasons for it, and I'm sure parts of it will get covered through this whole dialogue that we'll be having. But let me put it across saying that there is 3 parts to this. And as I mentioned, we are looking at IP, which is India. So the first part of it is the fact, where is the company at when it is seeking that funding? Has it reached that funding where it needs to get commercial funding, especially when you're looking at science and technology? It needs to be at a place where you have reached that milestone to get commercial funding, because typically in science-based technology, deep technology, disruptive cycle, the first part of it largely comes from grant government funding. And that's typically, it's not commercial funding that comes in. Either it has to be an industry which is investing into a technology, or it is an academic institution, or it is supported by incubators, accelerators. So largely coming from commercial, non-commercial or subvented capital of sources, where I would put that across. So it's largely commercial, not as commercial as it is. So we come and step in when there is commercial capital that's required. And so that's one part of the problem, is the fact a lot of enterprises are not out of that range where they are getting into the commercialization range. So VC funds, and I'm talking about VC funds because that's the capital source that most of the enterprises are looking for. The VC funds are from taking a techno-commercial risk at different stages. At an early stage, you're looking at the commercialization techno-commercial journey, and then it is a growth path that's the case, but it's a commercialization journey. So one of the biggest issues is the factors of companies deciding, in fact, are they falling into the bucket of it? Are they ready for commercial capital? The second is that the number of players in that space itself of the risks that you're taking, are they enough in the ecosystem that you're in? Are there enough players willing to take the first part of the commercialization journey in the ecosystem that you're in? And there is a gap there. And that's because of the risk that you would need to take on commensurate with the return that you can get. And the rest of the ecosystem, is there to give you that returns in terms of the risk return profile? So capital flow could still be restricted because the entire risk return has not been worked out or is underdeveloped or immature in many markets. So if you go to the US and you are a biotech company, there are enough players who will be willing to take that risk. If you are looking at Asian, African markets, there might be lesser number of players who are willing to take that risk. And the third bit of it is the fact that of how well are these companies, are these really likely to be global plays? Is this looking at venture kind of returns, or these are more of PE-ish kind of returns? What is a return profile that you're looking at? And is it really a VC-able opportunity? That's where the third bucket falls and where there are lots of issues. So I broadly put it across as these three, saying one, company is coming in without, or there's not enough capital for incubation, for getting the pilots done, and are you ready to commercialize? That's not enough capital available for that. The second is that there is not enough risk return maturity in the market in which you are in. So, and hence there's difficulty in getting that funding. And the third is on the enterprises themselves. Are you really looking at VC-able disruptive technologies which can really scale up and be global plays? That I would put as a combination of these three, and I'm sure we would dwell deeper in it as we go along. I hope
Thank you.
that answers
Thanks.
your question.
Yes, it did. And I think it gave us a good framework actually for me to go to Robert at this point, right? So I think what Rema has done for us is actually spoken of the continuum to some extent, right? Companies that tend to be in the 1 to 5 million layer, they tend to be beyond the stage of where grant capital is useful to them, but maybe they are too early to absorb structured debt. VCs or venture capital style returns, and therefore investments can be made for a finite set of companies. Robert, now from your own vantage view, as formerly with FNO, you were also very active with Spring Accelerator. You now, of course, are in the advisory space. Give us a sense of what your own journey has been like and what your observations on this are, and nudge us towards what a possible solution architecture looks like.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And hello, everyone. And yeah, like you said, I have worked with and led several, or a few, I should say, accelerators. And then most recently, the past several years, working with FMO, the Dutch Development Bank. And I think that's also reflective of what we've seen in the ecosystem in terms of we now have many more accelerators, incubators, or intermediaries in market, which we need in terms of providing the support to this missing middle of small and growing businesses, because it isn't just about capital, but it is about the capacity building and support. And then also these different players in market that are able to provide those services. I think what we have now begun to see is that there's often too many players in market that are perhaps doing that from a nonprofit mindset. And so I think what is important, and I think we've already started to see this trend in market, is how accelerators and venture studios, and of course, even fund managers who are providing that capacity building alongside or aligned with some investment mechanisms. And so I think it is important that we are looking at how do you provide that necessary support to businesses, which is oftentimes through grant capital and support and funding that is needed for these players in market, but done through an investment mindset or done with players that also have ties to investment capital, so that you're really able to then have people in market who understand the nuances around how to sequence that support and capital and advise these businesses on what is the right capital and the right support that they need to continue on that journey. So I think that's, what we hopefully will continue to see more of. And I think we are seeing that even with the trend around the development finance institutions as they are beginning to go more upstream and do more early stage work, because there's realizing and also, let's say, feeling the pressure to do that in terms of how they're building out that pipeline of investable opportunities for themselves and, of course, more commercial investors. And so I think that is a key group to then be programming more of the grant and concessionary capital alongside the investment mechanisms and supporting the right intermediaries who are doing that and taking that approach appropriately to hopefully see, let's say, more significant progress in supporting this missing middle and scaling more businesses there. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. I think we'll come back and talk about what shape or form should that take. Should we start seeing more blended finance opportunities earlier? Should we see more setup, seeding of fund of funds with domestic capital in play, which then leads to the creation of more venture capital and so on and so forth? But we'll come to that as we come to that. Rim, I want to invite you into this conversation now. Rim Asirar manages, she's head of investments at Mirova, which manages 3+ funds, over $500 million in AUM. Unlike Rema, who looks at equity, Rim focuses on the debt side of things explicitly. And you all invest across various emerging markets, Rim. So really from your vantage point, give us a sense of where you see the most critical gap, and what will it take for debt providers to step into this space without, one point that Emma made in her own way, compromising the risk compliance from a fund perspective. Give us a sense of also maybe what the limited partner view is on this, right? And what compulsions as a fund manager you work under, which prevents you perhaps from investing in this $1 to $5 million space.
Thank you so much, Sina. Hi, everybody. Fascinating question. There is so much to say about this. From where we sit, I think to build on also what Rema was saying, we see this financing as a continuum, right? And each player in the space has its role to play. From our perspective, also, we've seen a growth and a change in the types of financing that we're able to provide. In the earlier days, we were the Sunfunder team, so really actively providing this $1 to $5 million debt facilities to the off-grid solar space, started out of Africa and then expanded beyond to Asia and other markets. So we really were practitioners of this missing middle. And what we have realized is that it is a space where there is both the greatest financing gap, but also some of the most compelling opportunities, because some of those companies that we financed in the earlier phases, the D-Lights, the Greenlight Planets of this world, now became multi-million top-line companies and are raising multi-million SPV-backed facilities with local banks. So really great success stories from that standpoint. So from where we sat, the challenge that we faced was honestly mostly structural. It is a ticket size that makes it sometimes difficult to justify the cost of a transaction for an international investors that, yes, has access to blended finance, but also battles with kind of the economical dynamics of managing a portfolio of depending on the size of exactly your fund, can be quite a large number of underlying companies if you are in this $1 to $5 million range. And that cost to tickets ratio is really something that GPs look at as one of the true kind of hindrance for us to be able to do that successfully. But that being said, I think we also, throughout our experience, tried to develop concrete ways of going beyond this. One of it is to partner with other like-minded investors that may have done a portion of the due diligence that we can rely on, ways that we could find to reduce this cost to ticket ratio. The second part of it is also in the types of projects that we looked at. We have to also recognize, back to Rema's point on maturity of the companies, that even from blended finance vehicles is not for all companies at all stages of growth. It is also important for companies to reach for the right type of capital at the right time of their development, to also not create structural mismatches in their capital tables and in their balance sheets throughout their growth. So we sit in a bit of we generally say that we are senior secured debts, but with some of our investments, we really did some venture debts. So this is what we would put in this $1 to $5 million bucket.
All right. So clearly, like fund dynamics, size of funds, as It's contrarian, ironical, actually, in that sense, right? As the funds become larger, they tend to take lower risk, or their appetite for risk reduces, right? Which is really, I think, the crux of the problem here in a way. And we'll talk about some of the solutions, but I think just the right time to pull in the two founders into this conversation. So we'll start with Surinder Dati, who actually runs a company called Prom Technologies out of India, dairy tech, situated in the state of Gujarat, and has recently started expanding into Africa through a program that Intellicap hosted. So he is now, while he's built out and scaled the business in India, he's now also operating the company out of Africa. And from Surinder, really, it would be good to understand from you what your own fundraising journey has looked like. What have been some of the most crucial breakpoints in that journey? So I think if you can talk to us on that, it'll give us a view and framework from an entrepreneur's perspective.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Just a brief about Prom. We are a dairy technology company providing products and solutions to the Indian dairy sector. Specifically, we provide solar-powered rapid chilling instruments, which are meant to eliminate spoilage, improve the quality of the milk, and also address the energy efficiency challenge in terms of the sustainability, the climate change. So our technology is meant for farmers, but it's something that the farmers cannot afford to take it directly. So we normally work with the dairies. And globally, this sector is run by the cooperatives or the private dairies across the globe. We started our journey about 5-6 years ago with the intention of addressing these challenges, which I mentioned, with the what I call the patient seed capital of the founders and the parent company itself. And that we built a set of products. We did a lot of demonstrations across multiple geographies. We also did demonstrations for all the stakeholders, all the beneficiaries. We worked with the government. We convinced the value of this particular product. Won a few awards along the way. We supplemented it with some grants also, which helped us to further steer along this process. And ultimately, we reached a stage where I would say that we are now at the precipice of the proverbial valley of death, if you call it, because that's the gap. I'm now bringing in the technology commercialization analogy with your funding gap analogy. Basically, that we are at a stage where now, in order for us to scale, we need the type of funds that would allow us to take to the next level. The question is, why is this challenge, right? What makes us need these kinds of additional fundings? Why was a seed not enough to take us to all the way through? And there are multiple reasons for it. One of them is the classic economics of scale paradox. You would know, any entrepreneur would know in my shoes that the prototypes are always more expensive compared to the volume produced goods. And so it's a classic case where I know that the price point in the market is very nice at a certain price point. However, in order to reach that volume, I have to seed it with a lot of demonstrations with high value prototypes. And so that journey actually is that stage. We are at that stage in our journey now where the early demonstrations have been done, but it's now time to scale it to a level where you want to demonstrate it at a larger scale with the unit economics working out. The unit economics don't work out initially because, as I mentioned, the prototypes are more expensive compared to the production, high volume production stage. So it's a classic catch-22 of scale that any entrepreneur goes through when he moves from early demonstrations and early success stories to the full market potential and to full market scale. And that's where we are at. The rate of adoption is always a little slower than what an entrepreneur starts out with. And there are multiple reasons for it. But in our particular case, it's also a function of the incentivization of the parameters that we offer. Our products are based on three parameters. One is the spoilage reduction, which has got a very tangible value. Everybody understands that. But then the other two parameters called quality and sustainability or climate change are something where a farmer, he understands, he appreciates, but he's not willing to pay for those two things. So it is an incentive challenge that we have, and we need to bring that awareness more and more, whether it is in terms of policy, whether it is in terms of dairy, whether it is in terms of more wide-scale demonstrations. So in order for us to do all these demonstrations at scale and to further get the recognition that yes, indeed, this would be viable on its own merit, is where the classic funding gap comes in. And we are at that stage, but we are trying to go through that. And I must acknowledge grants like the Gates Foundation grant that we got earlier, which allowed us to venture into Kenya, to East Africa. And now we are realizing that the amount of potential that there is in East Africa and even in Zambia, where we have some good success stories, is far more possibly than what we have here because of the energy challenge, because of the other things. So with that, I will hold for now and wait for the next question. Thank you.
That's right. And on the other hand, the last panelist over here, Atharva Thembekar, who now runs Lean Energy, Atharv, right? They are a business 20 years old. So they've crossed this gap, Sudhinder, that you spoke about, with no real capital available to them, but they've continued to build. And they're at a point now when there is capital available for them to scale exponentially, they ask the question of their investors more critically, right? So I think it'd be good for you, Atharva, to come and share the story of how Lean Energy got built with very little commercial capital available to you and where you find yourself at this juncture.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Lean Energy is basically a utilities outsourcing company. So we provide utilities like steam, power, heat to commercial industrial clients. We set up the equipment on site, we operate it, we maintain it, and we sell the utility over the contract. We were the pioneers of our product is steam as a service. So we provide basically steam across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So we didn't have any institutional capital when we began, but what that did was that really taught us discipline. It forced us to understand unit economics, customer reality, operational efficiency very early in the business. So we never really had the luxury of burning capital to discover our business model. But it absolutely came at a cost. The biggest cost was definitely speed. So in clean energy, timing matters. We saw opportunities in the commercial and industrial solar energy space, as well as the energy efficiency space, but we weren't really. So we saw that opportunity before the market was matured. And we often had to grow at the pace of the retained earnings as opposed to the market demand, which was quite difficult. The second cost was, of course, strategic positioning. So when you bootstrap for too long, you actually optimize for survivability rather than scale. So this means that you avoid the larger projects, you delay the expansions into different countries, and you underinvest in talented technology, which was definitely a price that we're paying today. And the third cost is basically the opportunity loss. So there are partnerships you cannot enter, procurement cycles, and customers you cannot absorb just because your balance sheet is not yet big enough. But thankfully now, after 20 years, we're able to now look at the bigger projects, and now we're seeing a much faster growth within the organization. So many African enterprises are not failing because the demand is absent. They're failing because the financing architecture is just not right, where we have venture capitalists who want exponential growth, which is difficult to attain, or you have banks that want highly collateralized financing, which of course for companies starting up can be pretty difficult. So if the right capital existed, we would definitely deploy it in three things. So working capital, asset-backed financing, and of course, capability expansions into different regions, taking on bigger projects. So what I would say, just my closing remarks would be that what enterprises like ours, they need a patient, context-aware capital that understands the infrastructure and banks on the cash flows as opposed to the more basic ways of financing.
All right, I think beautifully put, Atharva. I'm going to go immediately to Robert on this, and then perhaps Rim, you can come in as well, right? I think what Atharva, the point that he's trying to make is, was it this supposed to have been the promise of blended finance, right? To bring together different types of capital, different types of color of money, and package it in a way that it's suitable for the lean energies of the world and imminently prompt technologies of the world. The point that Sutinder was making, very similar. I know we discussed where we've gone wrong, Robert. So if we've taken that forward, what would the reimagination of this be, right? And talk to us about that, right? What is the missing piece apart from the point that no one really wants to take the risk, except for the entrepreneurs who build and continue to build?
Sure. Yeah. So I think from a blended capital model, I think what we've seen is that space has been growing in the later stage investing markets where the economics are easier to facilitate that. And what I think has been slower to realize is how more grant and concessionary capital is brought into blended mechanisms to allow more blended mechanisms to service this missing middle, to service smaller ticket sizes. And what we are and have been seeing in the past few years is how we're starting to see more models, or really more kinds of blended funds, or new emerging fund managers who are taking the risk and being creative and fundraising themselves across the spectrum to get the grant capital that they set up these kind of funds, and then not only bring in the grant concessionary capital to the actual funding model to service the sector. And we're still in early days for that. So I think we will continue to hopefully see more and more of this, and players that are then able to support these new fund managers, such as new fund-to-fund models and other wholesale structures that are servicing these new emerging managers. So for instance, I think a real standout model is Chigaba, which is a fund out of Ghana, West Africa focused, and it has leveraged several institutional investors from the grant concessionary side to DFIs, and also leveraging pension funds, which is a new stakeholder investor group to this asset class, essentially, right? And so what they've been doing and others are doing across the continent are beginning to work more with pension trustees to get them comfortable with impact investing and investing in the real economy and the missing middle, which we're talking about. And then the fund managers, and building the relationships and understanding with the fund managers that are able to do that and co-invest alongside them and invest in those fund managers, all of which is built into the model of Chigaba. And so I think they're already starting to work and help others in replicating different versions of that in other markets, because there's nuances across that space. But I think that is an exciting trend that we're seeing more of, and that will then again enable the chain of capital into the right fund managers in market who are able to service the missing middle.
All right. Rema, you want to reflect on this, right? As someone who is now on their second fund, you raise capital from outside the country, possibly also recipient of capital from our own fund of fund structure that the government of India set up close to 10 years ago, which actually catalyzed a lot of new fund managers, right? And the entire early stage investment ecosystem in the country, right? With sudden burst out of over 1,000 odd early stage fund managers who are investing capital. How are conversations for you evolving as you speak to your LPs and try to bring together these different pools of capital that you then use your own mojo to invest? Raman, you're on mute again.
No, so first is the fact we are investing from our third fund now. So that's one. The second is that, and I would speak from the India experience, more from the other experiences. So there's two buckets at the kinds of enterprise. Let me put it this way. There are three kinds of companies that you're looking at. One is the deep science and technology, IP-led companies is one. The second bit is where there is innovations and business models, and that's is the second bucket. And the third bucket is basically businesses which have been around for some time, but you're looking at slight modification and the business models, but it's not completely different, right? The thing is that a large part of our investments are coming from the first bucket, which is very technology and disruptive led. So I would be able to comment much lesser on the second and third bucket, which is more of businesses that have had different structures, and there could be differences, but fundamentally if you strip it aside, the business models might be very similar from existing ones, right? And we did take a few bets on those, and I can just tell you about our experience on that. I'm sure there is a lot more. That when you're running a venture fund, you're looking from that you accept that there's going to be failures, and only about 20% would be 25% would be multi-baggers, where even though they would give you anywhere between 5-10x of the money that you have put into them. And the second bucket, the large part of the businesses, which is around 30-40% of the businesses, do not succeed as businesses. They might be lifestyle businesses, but they are unable to give the fund back. And even if they give the fund back, it'll be just about the capital or a part of their capital that you've invested in them, right? And the third is obviously 20-30% of them which don't make it. So for us, we at early stage funds, and I cannot talk about a B fund because their model is very different, right? But in VC funds, early stage funds, it becomes difficult for us to invest into companies that are more modifications of existing business structures as well, because of fundamentally the way in which these businesses have scale up and the way they return the money back to us as well. What's happening is the fact, because of this, when we go to raise money from the market as well, our LPs also strip it aside, strip apart what the kind of companies we invest in and see what's the kind of return that we can make, right? And so either you have to look at structures which are more blended finance, like what Robert does, and would need to be a very different kind of capital that you will require for that. But in the early stage 1 to 5, and the bet that we had to then take was the fact we will do lesser of those which are more like models that are existing models and concentrate more on disruptive models. We know we're taking a risk that either it will be a complete success or would be a failure, but more binary, because that's the way the business developed, because that was coming from the money that we were getting as invested from our LPs as well. Because our LPs looked for the fact that if you are looking for funding more business models which are more akin to existing businesses, then they would rather look towards more debt kind of scenario. If you look at it from an Indian market scenario, there are very few that have what Robert was talking about. And that would address, let's say, what the entrepreneurs were talking about as well. We do not have that structure because the market dynamics is not evolving towards that. So either you have venture capital or you have debt-like structures, or you have, so it's more siloed is where it's coming into. You do not have these kind of too many of there are some options, but they're far and few in between. Because then the kind of capital that they would have to get would have to come from philanthropic capital. And that philanthropic capital is not coming towards India. It's definitely not coming towards India. So somewhere there's been a mismatch in terms of how the capital flows have happened, what the entrepreneur demands are, and people like us who are intermediaries, what we can meet as well. So we don't have the philanthropy capital that looks at blended finance. Very little of that is available
Yes.
in doing companies.
Which is perhaps also speaks to the kind of large number of what you would call technology or tech innovative companies, marketplaces, etc., that have evolved disproportionately in the last 10, 15 years, right? Largely all venture capital backed, and less space for businesses of the kind that Sudhinder is building, right? They still struggle to find the right form of capital structures that make them truly scalable, right, across the large geography that India itself is. But Rim, I want to bring you in at this point, right? So I think, sorry,
Just
Rim.
want to complete one thing, right? I mean,
Yes.
also have to remember the fact that it just, as you were saying it, I realized I did not perhaps articulate that fund managers are basically intermediaries, right? And we have to base our business models, while we could be driven by what we would want to do. Ultimately, we need to get the capital to be able to do that. And that capital that comes into India is far more, we do not have that luxury of being able to do the kind of blended finance that would be needed. It comes into more commercial return VC capital, or it will be debt-like capital, but philanthropic capital is not available. So the intermediaries cannot construct structures which would enable to meet the entrepreneur needs. The missing is the fact it's not the intermediaries problem, but it's where the capital flow is coming
The origination problem. Rim, you want to reflect on both points that Robert made as well as Rema's now making. It almost feels like where Mirova is today, y'all are sitting at a cusp where y'all can actually absorb a large amount of capital. You also have the advantage of what you've seen evolve in Africa, where it seems prima facie there is a lot more, I would say, innovative structuring of capital that takes place vis-a-vis India. Give us, if you can pick up from the points that Rema was making as well as Robert made, and take us towards what you feel a solution architecture might look like for the missing middle.
Yeah. Thanks, Ina. Yeah, just to build on what was just said, and then I'll get to some of the innovations we're seeing. I do agree on the fact that we are conduits, the financiers in the space. We're matchmakers. So it is also our role to share with LPs what we see on the ground. And I do agree with Rema that there is also a certain frilosity from a certain typology of investors that could be very relevant for this space, more philanthropic, but also more DFIs. I want to say that DFIs do a lot for sure in this space, but sometimes we see them moving a little bit towards more of the commercial type of requirements that we see, honestly, private institutional capital ask us. So there is also just a bit of a reality check with some of our long-standing partners in the DFI community, where we have to have the honest conversation on the type of capital they manage versus the type of capital that's really needed, because they are the partners that know best these markets, that know best what and how we can do this together. And fund managers like ourselves and the fund that Rema manages can be really the right partners for these type of capital to be channeled towards, because we can address this, let's call it between 1 to 10, and grow with these entrepreneurs. Because just one comment on also what we've heard from the entrepreneurs in the webinar today is also the level of intensity that's required in a fundraising process, right? We know we have quite a lot of requirements and so on. So it is also important for entrepreneurs to join forces with financiers that are able to grow with them. And that's been also our story at Sunfunder and now Mirova, which is this ability to grow with entrepreneurs and build that relationship from the start, and then be able to be the growth capital for 10, 15, now 20 to $25 million with the same entrepreneurs and the same companies that we have been almost seeding on the debt side around 10 years ago. So how can we do this very concretely? So I think for us, and just giving an example on the fund that we currently manage, which is a $340 million fund. So the reality of our early years of investment makes it very difficult for us to do the 1 to 5, very honestly. However, we can do the 5 to 10. And the way we have started to work with some of the companies that need this type of capital is to build portfolio models and platform approaches, where we provide a loan of up to 10 million, for example, and then this capital is unlocked or committed as the company reaches certain milestones, as the company grows. But at least the company and the entrepreneurs have very clear visibility on what it would take for them to unlock such capital. And I really believe in the scale, because 1 to 5 is great, but this is not what's going to get. Sorry, I can't remember the name of your pumps for the entrepreneur that's active in India and now entering the African market. But you need a lot more visibility, particularly on your asset financing and your working capital financing, to be able to enter into those new markets, to be able to invest. So this is the approach that we're taking with the entrepreneurs. So really building this kind of committed facilities in stages and then grow with entrepreneurs. And the other elements that we've been trying to work on is also when there is risk-sharing mechanisms that are in place. I'll give you one example in the mini-grid space, where there is quite a few RBFs, or results-based financing out there, that companies are able to unlock at the connection, but all of the construction, all of the development is still has to still be funded. We've been able to get comfortable with that early stage risk and relying on the cash flows from those grants to allow those assets to be built and help those companies develop those grids and then be able to unlock this capital at the point of connection. So I would say, yeah, 2 very practical ways we've been able to do it. One, which is just a structuring mechanism for us to get comfortable. And then the second one, which is how we can come together with different types of capital. So the blending does not happen at the fund level, because the blending happens in the way the company unlocks different types of capital that work together.
All right. Puts the onus back on the entrepreneur to figure out what is needed at different points of time. Robert, you spoke about earlier on some newer mechanisms that are in place that are actually allowing for catalytic concessionary capital pools to do what Andrew made the point as well, originally meant to do, which is address risk, drive systems change, and so on. We seem to have moved away from that flight to safety in that sense. Blended finance deals happen at $65, $70 million average ticket size. So I think this brings us back to what role you would like to see the DFIs play, what role you would like to see the philanthropic or the foundation, money that comes from large foundations play in evolving these structures or bringing that next level of iteration to newer models, right? Is revenue-based financing an answer? And if yes, what do we need to do it at scale? I think even in India, we at best have maybe 2 or 3 funds, not more than $700-800 million pooled that does revenue-based financing, right? A drop in the ocean.
Yeah, let me address the fact that I think there's a mismatch of expectations of where DFIs are at and what they're structured and capable to do. And look, and this was one of my first realizations 6-7 years ago when I started working closely with one. And the fact is that it's still early days for DFIs in terms of changing the way that they are structured to be able to service this missing middle, because of the return expectations that are just built into the kinds of capital that they are managing. But again, what we have been seeing, and I did see a real sea change in my time with FMO in terms of how they are now really embracing this earlier stage, and what now FMO has baked into its corporate strategy, as they call their market creation strategy, which was announced 3 years ago. And it's been an evolution for them, still embracing that and determining how to actually do that work, because it's very broad and there's a lot of different ways, and they're trying to align it with the more core later stage work that they do. And of course, BII and several others are on the same kind of journey that are really starting to lean into this space. And one thing that I've held on to in the current dynamics that we're seeing across the development industry, and let's say the tightening of budgets that some of the development players are seeing, those that are still around, is the fact that there's more of that capital being channeled through DFIs. And I think, again, that's what we will hopefully continue to see more of, so that then the DFIs are actually able to work in this space and to have the different mechanisms and funds that they're managing to channel that capital into space. And then also, as I think is really built into FMO strategy, it's not just about them servicing the space, right? It's about the other fund managers and intermediaries that are out there and have been doing this work for a while that need this kind of capital, but then also some of the other newer players and newer blended models. All of these folks need capital that the DFIs will continue to help in channeling to this space. So I think that's one clear element that, again, is still early days. And then also you really need to see, and I think there's a continued focus on how are we getting more local capital to service this space. And I mentioned this earlier around local pension funds in some of the markets, particularly Africa. And of course, I'm, let's say, more speaking from the Africa lens, which is where I've been focused the past 7+ years, and how there's an increased interest from that. But I think there's also a need and a focus on other types of local investors, angel investors, and successful business manager or business owners reinvesting. And of course, we have seen that, I think, more of in India, which has been very clearly helpful in creating the ecosystem of support for early stage businesses. But again, we're still in the early days of that actually taking place in Africa and many markets. So I think we can continue to figure out how do we align the other types of fund managers and players with these other local capital providers, and all of that can have kind of a cyclical effect in supporting more of local businesses in these markets. So yeah, I think these are some of hopeful signs that we can continue to look at, and that again we'll then see more of the blended finance type solutions that are actually servicing this missing middle gap.
All right. Rema, you want to speak to this last point, right? Really, in India, what we saw, the entire HNI, ultra HNI community, the domestic family offices, many of whom now have their own seed funds and so on. That entire continuum of capital, which is a point that you made earlier as well, has gotten built out, right? We have seen a fair share of the venture studios, the accelerators, incubators, also actually come up endowed and supported not just by government at a central level and state governments, but also by a lot of domestic philanthropic capital, which in many cases has also helped entrepreneurs bridge that gap to some extent, right? Where they might have then bypassed venture capital, scaled and gone into more commercial capital being made available to them. That evolution in India has taken 15 odd years, right? What, from your lens, what are some of the learnings from that can be extrapolated, or from your point of view, what has that done for the growth of the entrepreneurial ecosystem?
So in the first thing I would say is the fact it's not that India has already reached it. It is still in the process, I would say. It's on. The first part of it is the fact a large part of the Sorry, so let me take a step back here. So one is the fact that you need to remember that India is a large market. And one of the things that helped in India was that because of this large consumer market that we had a lot of international money come into the country to kickstart the VC ecosystem largely. So a large part of what you saw in the last decade was largely with two major pools of capital. One was Government of India, and the other was international capital. So I would want to make that clear. That has to be that the government has to come in with a large amount of capital, and the international capital comes in with the clear sight to making commercial returns. So that's the two thing. The third part of it, even in international capital, which is DFI capital that Robert was mentioning, that in countries like India, when DFI capital comes in, invariably, and I would say it's the fact that there could be some exceptions here and there, but even the DFI capital comes in with a very clear mandate of commercial returns. Okay. And I'm talking of what is happening in the last 10 years. I'm not talking of earlier to it, where there was some softer parts of the capital came in, but in the last decade, and more so now, that whether it's the DFI or whether it's larger institutional finance coming into the country is all commercial capital. And the ecosystem has evolved, the small amounts of capital that's available for this. The second has been that, so the structures are formed. So even where the family offices have moved in, they have moved into where the risk return profiles have already been established. In the revenue-based financing, like what Saina you pointed out, the return is still more debt-like, whereas the risk is still more, and hence that part of that capital has not scaled up, whether with international or local capital, it hasn't scaled up because of this risk-return mismatch. There's not enough capital to say is the fact I'm willing to take a higher risk, but a lower return. And so that capital is still a missing capital in India. And the ability for startup entrepreneurs, and I really know the pain that they are going through because they don't have the cash flows to be able to clearly say that I would be able to return this and that was a blended capital that I can come in that. So that the revenue-based financing has not. There are some pockets of it, and if you see that a large part of it is also getting restated to become venture funding. So it still continues to be a gap in India as well. It's not that it has been, even the family office continues. Yes, what is now available is a fact where the risk return is already established. The family offices have moved. It was grounded by government capital and international capital, and then now the family capital pool is also available for that. But the risk return being not completely aligned is the capital that's still not there in India as yet. That capital is available. If you go in the US, for example, there are government pools of money at state levels which is available for addressing this particular gap. I know of various states in the US where if you are an early stage entrepreneur and you haven't scaled up, if you get, let's say, an X amount of equity capital, you will get maybe same or twice or depending upon the state. And I think you have different types of blended capital that are available, right? And so that's a major thing that you are de-risked. In India, it's available, but to a very small extent, which is 5 crores that the central government has towards the some CGT MSME scheme. It's very difficult to get that money. It's just almost impossible to get it. So that's a problem that continues to be in India. The equity capital has been fairly matured in India. And I would say that's something that if you look to do it in Africa, it needs to be coming with government capital, international capital, and local capital will move in one those. They see the successes in those.
All right. Atharva, your reflections on everything the investors have spoken about for the last 30 odd minutes, right? There seem to be some green shoots of different sort of structures available. To your mind, has your pain point been solved? Do you see some of these newer structures around revenue-based financing, around more hybrid funds, perhaps around more government anchored pools of capital becoming available as solutions that would be useful for an organization like yours?
Oh, absolutely. There were definitely some interesting solutions that can come in. I think, and in most, how Africa is looked at is also from a risk perspective is also something that needs to be looked at because now since the company, so we've been around for almost 20 years, and some of the interest rates that some of the DFIs as well as the bigger institutions give are they're quite high and if you look at the risk profile where you see the company cash flows, any company would get a much lower interest rate if you were in the West or probably other regions. So that sort of also needs to be looked at. But I think some of the solutions do make sense. And yeah, so just that sweet spot where companies can come in, where financial institutions can come in and not just expect like venture-based returns or high collaterals for some of the financing that we get, because most of these renewable energy businesses, they're infrastructure light and they're more cash flow based and project driven. They don't fit in either of those models cleanly. But yeah, that'd be my take.
Yeah. Rim, from your own vantage point, and Robert, what would we need to see, or what would need to be some of the tectonic shifts, so to say, for revenue-based financing to become more mainstream? Because it seems to be the wedge between high-cost debt and venture equity style investing. Rim?
Sure. It depends how it's structured for me. I think one of the issues that we've seen also in RBFs that we've come across is how they lack standardization. I think this is also one of the key issues that we have to solve in this missing middle. Is just the programs have to be and the tools have to be replicable and standardizable, if that's a word, to a large extent, so that they become a real tool that we can build upon. We have given this kind of feedback to some grant providers, typically of certain RBF programs and so on, and that's now being taken into consideration, and there is more alignment between the different sources of capitals and capital allocators to make those programs more standardized for financiers, but also for entrepreneurs. I think that's one of the key practical elements that we can aim towards. The second element is, and this is honestly, I don't have a solution for this, is also knowledge of what is out there. I think these platforms, Sankalp and others, are great platforms for financiers, but also entrepreneurs to be aware of what is out there. And I was reading through the chat, I think somebody is also recognizing that entrepreneurs are not necessarily also aware of everything that's out there for them. We try to do our part on our side. So typically, I think the structure I mentioned on construction finance pre-RBF, it was something that we have structured on behalf of the company. So it was not company driven, it was really financier driven to bring that innovation out to the space. So yeah, I see those 2 points as potentially one of the 2 levers we can work on.
Robert? And I also know that there is, Parminder's asked a question around where do you see remittance investment in the blended capital model, especially in Africa, to either one of the panelists who want to take it. Rim, if you have a reflection on it, or Robert.
Yeah, maybe I'll weave into my question here to talk to my answer here, because you were asking about results-based financing. And I think that is just one of the models that we need to see reflected in how funds are managed, right? So I think what has been a realization in the past few years is that the typical 220 model of VC funds is not working across a lot of markets. And so what then is the fund structure that can service this missing middle. And there are a lot of different models that are doing that. And it's still early days to prove out which ones are successful. Or I would argue there's just a variety of ways that it can be done. And it, again, is going to take more impact investors, more donors, folks with concessionary grant capital, those realize the value of patient capital, which somebody was flagging in the chat, to then actually start to work with fund managers. Again, there's been this unfortunate divide between a lot of the donor traditional development world and fund managers, but I think that is changing, hopefully more rapidly than we're seeing now. But again, we're going to continue to educate the more traditional players in this space with what for-profit seeking fund managers are need, because I think it's not just purely about profit, right? You have a lot of folks dedicated to these markets that have an impact lens and desire, whether they're leading with that narrative or not. And so I think it is about bringing in, again, more of these donor development players into this space. And yes, also remittances and diaspora, who are very committed to supporting their countries of origin, but then the mechanisms that are able to channel the remittances and diaspora funding appropriately. I think that is what we really haven't seen a lot of. And coming from the US, where I lived up until about 9 years ago, I think there has been a lot of good traction on the diaspora front with diaspora impact bonds, but they didn't really take off. And I would argue there still we haven't seen that really take off from a UK perspective, at least focusing on Africa. So that's been something I've actually been trying to lean into and talk with a lot of folks who are working on that. So again, these are the kind of funds and mechanisms that we need in place to then support that. But I do think it's still very early days to actually see how you are pooling remittances and diaspora capital into mechanisms that are actually able to invest, and the fund managers that are able to work with those groups in efficient ways. And there's some interesting technology plays that are starting to come to light that are enabling that. So yeah, trying to remain hopeful that we'll see more of those models.
Yeah, I think just reading through the chat, right? I think the angst is that capital at its origin that promises to be patient when put into a typical 10+2 structure with an IRR expectation of anywhere between 15 to 25, 30%, transforms itself as not so patient anymore, right? Which then becomes a challenge for some of these business models that really need that 15, 20-year time frame to scale and grow and break out in that sense. If I'm summarizing some of the things that have been brought up in the chat, right? So it really means going back to first principles and maybe, if I can, just to also wind this down, one crazy out of the box idea, right? To make capital go longer, to actually deliver on that promise of options and then therefore impact, right? What would that be? And maybe there were small experiments of it that have happened, things that you've seen in India, Africa, or elsewhere in the world, really, that you feel that if we're always taking bets on entrepreneurs to come up with innovative, different ideas, either on the business model or in core technology to deliver, right? These people who manage money, what could be one out of the box framework that we might explore? Any of you?
I don't have any out of the box things. I can understand the angst of the entrepreneurs. I'm an intermediary and I can only function within the scope of I try to match where my money comes in and where I can do. The money that comes to me is not patient. The money that comes to me expects a return. Today, one as a said, if you are geography interested in addressing a particular problem, then there is capital that's available for that. And Indian government has been very good at that. I can't speak of other governments. They have been able to get patient capital to some extent in, but that's still a small drop in the version of what capital that's available. And it's still, to some extent, it's not patient enough. But based on, it is more patient than other capital, but it's not as patient as what the entrepreneur wants. So that's the problem that you have. It's the fact that everybody wants to make money today, including the entrepreneur also would want to make returns, whether it's in this, and then the investors also want to make returns. So at the end of the day, we don't have really the patient capital that's available is a very small pool of that capital. In India, I've seen that the government of India has been supportive of that, and that has helped to where we are today. And then the government also expects that a lot of this will move towards market-based models. So they're willing to support some part of it, but they would want to quickly see that these become more market-ready models. There's been lots that the Indian government has done, but there is still a gap between what the entrepreneur ecosystem needs and the capital that gets.
All right, Sharma. Rim, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is definitely the hard truth that there is not enough of the type of capital we need for this gap. But I do believe, and I think some of the ideas that were mentioned notably by Robert with this new Ghana fund, I would be fascinated to hear more about it, particularly on the pension funds that have been catalyzed. Unfortunately, what we've seen on our side is that pension funds actually everywhere, not only in emerging markets, have expectations of returns which are pretty high. So yes, you get access to local capital, but then at what cost? So for entrepreneurs, it is also a bit of that conundrum that you have to solve between availability of capital and cost of capital to some extent. On our side, I think we just have to keep banging on the doors of people that have this type of capital. I think on our side, we did see in the off-grid space and the distributed renewable energy space, after, from our side, 15 years of investments in that space, and honestly, not much interest from the big guys out there. Over the past few years, we've seen governments, large DFIs putting together, if you're familiar with it, this initiative called Mission 300, where there is now finally really truly patient capital that's available for companies in the space, and initiatives across various governments, and an alignment of interest in making sure that this space of decentralized renewable energy gets the attention it deserves to solve part of the energy access problem in emerging markets, and solving it on both ends, right? On the grid connected and then on the distributed energy side. So it works. It's unfortunately not as fast as we would want it to be. So the pain of the very first years where entrepreneurs have to be really lean and try to, and particularly the ones who work with asset heavy business models, it is a reality, but I believe that there are a few of us out there that can support. And then it's upon all of us to continue their advocacy to make sure that the capital allocators hear us and provide the type of capital that's needed.
Sudhinder, you wanted to make a point, and then, sorry, Robert, I think Sudhinder has been waiting to make a point. So we'll hear him, and then I'll give you the last word.
Just one comment on a personal angle as an entrepreneur. I wanted to differentiate our capital requirements in India versus capital requirements in Africa. And I would say that we would require slightly different types of finances in each case. In India, we have a robust ecosystem, and here an industry ecosystem, the stakeholders, the paying customers. We also have an ecosystem of finance people. And so in India, our business can look for equity type of capital. But when it comes to Africa, we are exploring new fields. We are disrupting new avenues of doing things which have never been done before. And when you try to do that kind of a thing, you need more patient capital and different type of a funding. And so I just wanted to highlight that there is a difference in the capital requirement when I'm looking at the Indian market and I'm looking at the African market. And so the more patient capital, more long-term blended finance type of solutions are required over there, where we have to do a lot of demonstrations of new concepts, which have never been tried before. Whereas in India, we have paying customers, we have ROIs that can be demonstrated, and hence the capital is of a different structure. I just wanted to highlight that difference based on our personal experience in both the continents.
All right. Thanks for making that point, Sudhindra. Also, it makes me think about whether we actually need a different class of, we're speaking of intermediaries, different class of investment bankers too, right? That are able to structure this sort of complexity into workflows and really think about how they support entrepreneurs to approach and think of different forms of capital that are available out there. Because to put the onus on Sudhindra, who also has to build his business and try and decode every form of capital structure available to him, seems like too much of a tall task. Robert and Atharva, last points to you. Atharva, if you want to come in, or we can give the entrepreneur the last word. Robert, if you want to go first.
Either one.
Yeah, let's give the entrepreneur the last word, since they're the ones actually doing good stuff in market. But look, in terms of the fact that we need new mechanisms, new ways of thinking, I'm all for that, because there's a lot that is broken with traditional finance. And we got to keep pressing on how we're creating these new mechanisms. And so back to the question around getting more patient capital and market, and maybe an out of the box or really just a new mechanism that we need to see more of, and there's a lot of conversation around, is how are we addressing the liquidity problem? And this gets to patient capital, because if we're able to have mechanisms that allow LPs and more investors to get out of the investments that they're making faster, then you could get them to recycle their capital and get others incentivized to jump in to mechanisms that they don't have to wait so long. And so if you think about liquidity guarantee structures, and there is a brilliant one by October, the October Liquidity Guarantee Facility, and other DFIs and others, institutional investors, are starting to think about how you create more of these mechanisms that would, again, then allow for LPs to get out of an investment faster. And then therefore you would have mechanisms that would allow more patient capital to be invested to the entrepreneurs. So I think this is something, again, we're still in the very early days of seeing actual come to fruition as actual models in market, but there is a lot of talk about this within this blended finance DFI community. And of course, part of the drum that I keep banging on to help bring these things to market.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Robert. I think newer structures take time to bake. And yeah, you made a fair point about moving the capital in the system through the rigors faster, if it's possible. So I know there's another complex discussion to have, but yeah, Dharma, last word to you.
Yeah. So I think my final call to the investors would actually just be, and I think even Rim touched on this, where is just knowledge, right? So each business is different and has different needs with different capital needs. Some need long-term, some need short-term financing. So I think it's important that these investors spend more time understanding the business before deciding whether they're investable or non-investable, or if they if they can be given a loan or not. Just understanding their needs and taking it from use case to use case. So that will really bridge the gap of financing, and people will be more positive towards getting new investors on board who have both sorts of capital, who have patient capital as well as some capital that gets in much faster return. So I think it's a pool of everything that you have to have a full fund. The fund has to just have all sorts of capital ready for each of their businesses and see what they require and tailor make their solution to what the business needs. That sounds easier it's easier said than done, but yeah, I guess that's what we as a business would be looking for.
Yeah. So I don't want to be reductionist and say that it's actually all just an information asymmetry problem, but part of it is that, right? And which is why what we do at Sankalp and at Intellicap is actually try and make a lot of this more visible on either side, right? So that people, entrepreneurs especially, know what all is available to them, what are some of the options that they might explore. And then through our investment banking arm, we work actually towards structuring some of this capital. I think, albeit we work at a growth stage as well, way past the missing middle that we are talking about, because the dynamics of, like Rema said, how you earn the money and return the money tend to make sense at a later stage. But that's really where Sankalp comes in. And year on year, when we have different types of entrepreneurs and different types of fund managers come together at our summits, we do find solutions and we do make capital flow. And I hope that some of the conversations that we've had today are really seed for thoughts for us to go back and make visible some of these pools of capital to entrepreneurs more consciously. I think that's at least what I'm taking away from this, apart from which, of course, like Robert, Trema, and Jim said, at a much higher level, continue to have those very deep, penetrative dialogues with the DFIs, with the catalytic pools of capital, to see how some of those really can be fundamentally restructured for markets in Africa as well as in India. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we'll continue with our series of dialogues. Thank you, Atharva. Thank you, Sindar, Robert, Rema, Rim. I really appreciate all of you spending your Thursday evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.